Our good dead friend Socrates was put on trial, sentenced to death, and then drank the hemlock and died. Sorry, spoilers. Now, his trial is presented in the Apology, written by his student Socrates, and then the follow-up to the trial is, he's not immediately executed afterwards, is the Crito, in which Plato, through Socrates, the character of Socrates, describes his view of obedience and disobedience. Now, Socrates was apparently on trial for corrupting the youth and various other charges, but there are those who do contend that one of the reasons, in addition to annoying the elites of the city of Athens, is his alleged view that he distrusted democracy. And the argument presented by Plato is, in its essence, this, that competence is a matter of knowledge, and ruling competently, of course, would require this knowledge. People with the knowledge required to rule properly, which shockingly for Plato would be philosophical knowledge, will be uncommon. And so, by analogy, just as we would not choose, say, a doctor by voting, or if we're deciding how to, say, if you have trouble with your car and you're trying to decide how to fix it, you wouldn't ask people passing by, hey, let us vote to decide what to do. Or if you're undergoing, surgery, you wouldn't go and gather a bunch of, people who know nothing about medicine and say, hey, let us vote to see what is, what is cut and what is removed and what is kept. And so, by analogy, the character of Socrates concludes, we shouldn't choose our leaders through voting. So kind of an anti-democratic view. And yet, even though Athens at the time of Socrates' trial was kind of a democracy, he decided to, go to the trial. He ends up, as I mentioned before, found guilty, convicted, and then sticks around and accepts his fate, and then voluntarily drinks the hemlock. So this leads to the question of, why obey the state? Now, Socrates took the view that the state clearly should be obeyed, even to the point of drinking the hemlock and dying. And as we'll see when we look at the Crito, his key arguments, is that if you disagree with the law, you should either persuade the leaders to change the laws or leave. Before the trial, obviously. Now, Socrates, of course, believed he was unjustly convicted. He, as we'll see in the Crito, contends that his disobedience would be worse, would be an injustice, and would hurt him worse than death, which one could debate, but that's what he claimed. Now, the one exception to his obedience rule, or a major exception, is this. He did say that in the Apology, that if the state ordered him to stop being a philosopher, he would violate that order. He would keep practicing philosophy. But he contends that this would show respect for the state, because he is still trying to persuade the leaders to change their views, and he accepts the consequences of his actions. Now, Socrates is often presented as a social contract theorist, in a sense. Not in the sense of Locke and Hobbes, where he believes that there was a state of nature in which people, in this hypothetical state, form a contract, etc., but a kind of literal social contract in a, meaningful sense of you have a implicit contract with the state. Now, thinkers like Locke and others do present this view. It's called tacit consent. And Socrates seems to hold the view that when you're a citizen of the state, you engage in an implicit contract with the state. You don't have to explicitly agree and sign a deal with the state. And his reasoning is that because we get certain goods and services in exchange for our obedience, we should, go along with the state. And when we have a contract that is just, we should follow this. Now, Socrates is also often put in the context of being a natural law theorist, which later became very popular with thinkers like John Locke and, of course, Thomas Hobbes. And earlier than that, our good dead friend, St. Thomas Aquinas. So Socrates, on some interpretations, or perhaps Plato, depending on how much you think of Socrates as really in Plato's dialogues, holds that there is a universal moral law that you can know through reason, and you can sort of get triggered by experience. This law is not created by people and is above the laws of the state, and one can judge the laws of the state against these laws. Now, in the case of Plato and Socrates, as presented by Plato, he clearly believed in an objective moral reality, the good being the greatest form, and believing in an objective justice. So, on certain interpretations, Socrates could be seen as engaging in a social contract and also embracing a form of natural law theory, kind of broadly construed. Now, it could be argued that this is, kind of taking something ahead of Socrates, or, beyond Socrates' time, and then applying it backwards to him incorrectly, which could be debated. But now, let us turn to the Crito. So the issue being raised in the Crito, and I'm not going to grind through the entire dialogue line by line, the issue there is this. Is Socrates is attempting to escape an injustice? Because what has happened is, after his trial, again, Socrates in the trial is found guilty of various crimes, such as corrupting the youth, and then sentenced to death. And interestingly, apparently more people vote to sentence him to death than voted to find him guilty, presumably because he really annoyed people. And so he's scheduled to be executed, but according to the story, he cannot be executed during a certain time period because the citizens of Athens have sent a ship out to sea, essentially to commemorate Theseus, who, well, didn't really defeat the Minotaur, but kind of overcame the Minotaur, because the citizens of Athens used to, and others had to pay tribute to the king of Minos, and according to the story, he would feed them to his Minotaur, a creature with the head of a bull and the body of a human. So anyways, the long and short of it is, while the ship is out at sea, Socrates cannot be executed by the laws of Athens, so he has some time to do some philosophy. So his friends come and say they've roughly put, bribed the guards, they've got a boat ready to, ship ready to sail to another city-state, and everything's in place to bust Socrates out and take him to another city-state to keep on living. And Socrates, being Socrates, rather than just sort of going along with the breakout, decides to debate with his friends the ethics of what he is. So in response to his friends offering to bust him out and take him away to another city-state, he offers 3 arguments as to why he, Socrates, should remain and die. So his first argument is this. This is the benefit argument. So he contends that the state benefited him. It brought him into the world, it raised him, it educated him, and it gave him and all the other citizens a share of all the good things it could. Now again, he doesn't literally mean that it literally brought him to the world or literally raised him, but he believed that the state provided him with these, goods and services. And so this creates an obligation on the part of Socrates. Now, he does note the important point that in the city of Athens, anyone who is dissatisfied with the state could take his possessions and leave when he reached adulthood and decides that, he doesn't like the laws, administration of the state. And so people have the freedom to depart. But if you remain, according to Socrates, which he did for his whole life, and he's seen how justice is administered in the state, how the state is governed, and he believes that he's provided tacit consent, that the very fact of remaining gives his consent to the state, and this obligates him to do what the laws tell him. So this benefit argument begins with the state benefited him, and he secondly raises the important condition that he was free to depart the state at any point he wished, obviously up until he was, convicted and sentenced to death. So he contends that if he disobeys the state, and he says, doing so would be to act unjustly on 3 counts. He would disobey his parents, he would disobey those who raised him, and he would disobey, by us, he means the state, after he's agreed to obey the state, without persuading the state that they are, the leaders, that they are wrong. So he concludes that since the state benefited him, he had every opportunity to depart if he didn't like how things were going. To leave now, to escape, would be unjust. He would be, going back on his benefits, going back on his agreements, and this would be wrong for him. Now, this, of course, raises, a variety of interesting questions beyond just the particulars of the case of Socrates. The state does, in most cases, provide some things to the citizens, and there is the question, does that obligate you to obey the state? There's also the question of, are we actually free to depart the state? And in some sense, one can leave, but if you wanted to be totally free of all states, today you wouldn't have much in the way of options. Also, one could note that the state obviously doesn't treat all citizens equally well, and even though it offers, say, some benefits, there'd be the question of, does this actually create an obligation that the state provides some benefits, especially to those who get very little from the state and may actually be actively harmed in many occasions by the state. Now let's turn to his second argument. Now, the second one is obviously very particular to Socrates and would not generalize well unless you happen to be a philosopher on trial who could have left. Now, Socrates was given the opportunity in the trial to pick his own fate, and the option he presented was one that they were never going to accept, and his accuser, Meletus, the primary accuser, put forth death as his punishment, and many of the people who are experts on Plato and Socrates and stuff think that Meletus probably would have been happy if Socrates chose exile and just went away and became someone else's problem. But in any case, Socrates notes that he could have put forth the punishment of going into exile. And he could have gone into exile with the state's consent, rather than now escaping into exile without the state's consent, basically breaking the rulings of the law. And he says that he glorified in being willing to die, and he said that he preferred, death to exile. This, of course, to try to escape now, Socrates says, would be to go back on his words. He wouldn't respect the law, and he would be trying to destroy them and trying to run away, breaking contracts and agreements which he made as a citizen. Now, again, for most people, they're not going to be on trial, sentenced to death, and have had the opportunity to go into exile. But I suppose if that does happen, this would be relevant. But as a general thing, kind of the relevant thing would be that the part about contracts and agreements, that a person who engages in these contracts and agreements, and they agree to accept the punishment of the state, they'd be obligated to follow it, which segues into his third argument, which is the kind of the full contract argument. So the contract argument in full goes like this. So Socrates says that he agreed, not simply by his words, but by his actions, to live under the government of Athens. And if he decided just to take off, he would be breaking his contracts and agreements. So these obligate him. Now, he does consider cases that would allow for breaking a contract, 2 particular factors. One would be force. Socrates notes that a contract imposed by force would not be valid, and he would not be obligated to follow that. Secondly would be fraud. A deceitful, deceptive, contract, that he was entered into would not morally obligate him. Now, in the face of it, these seem reasonable. If one agrees to a contract and is not forced to agree to it and is not deceived or tricked, then it would seem one would be obligated. Now, going away from Socrates to, say, obedience today, one could make the argument that in many cases the states do impose contracts by force as a practical matter, because if one disagrees with the state will of course engage in force against them. Not necessarily like death, but will use its coercive powers, economic, etc. And of course, as I noted before, today as a practical matter, if you prefer not to be under the authority of any state, you'd rather not have some, rich psychopaths, ruling your life, then you don't really have much of a choice. You are the earth is controlled by mostly by various countries, and wherever you go in them, there's going to be somebody in charge telling you what to do, unless you go someplace where there's no government. But those are places that are really hard to survive, like out on the ice or way out in international waters. Not impossible, but rather difficult. And so it could be said that the state uses, there's no way to escape the state. And of course, depending on what country you're in and how you're treated by the state, everything may be a great deal of force and coercion. And of course, there is also the matter of fraud. The idea that, people are told, if you take the United States, for example, we're told things like, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, where all people are created equal. And as Dr. King noted in his I Have a Dream speech, there are all these promises made that are not promises kept. So people could make the argument that the contract is thus fraudulent, it's a lie, and therefore one is not obligated to obey such fraudulent contracts. Now, in the case of Socrates, getting back to him, he notes that he had lots of time to make up his mind. He, 70 years old, and if he'd been dissatisfied, he could have left. But he didn't prefer any other city-state, such as Sparta or Crete, and he didn't, want to go to any place ruled by barbarians, and he was satisfied with the state. And he asserts, of course, that he was satisfied with the laws, and that no one would be satisfied with a state with no laws, and to simply break his agreement would make him look ridiculous. And so, based on his contract, he decides to remain, he drinks the hemlock, and dies. And that is the end of our good dead friend, Socrates, and how it became our good dead friend.